I used to work as an overnight stocker for Walmart. For those of you who are unaware of what a Walmart is, it's pretty much an oversized convenience store, selling anything from clothing to food to electronics. If you are in need of something, chances are Walmart has it. As many of you are aware of what a stocker is, I suppose I should still explain what it is I did. Basically, whenever you walk into a store and you find yourself mindlessly glancing over all the various items on the shelves, somebody had to put them there. And that somebody was me. It's pretty much cut and dry as far as tasks go. Either you're taking inventory or unloading products from the back. However, for the most part, it's the movement of items from the back housing area to the shelves. For a lot of the youths in the US, working at Walmart is generally a first job location for those who don't wish to dive into the chaos that is fast food service. As for myself, I ended up with the job after recently getting laid off. The job market was rough at the time, and me needing an immediate source of income, I found few other options. The job itself was fairly simple, and the supervisors were quite lenient on some of the regulations. For example, during my shift, I would be allowed to listen to music on my iPod while I worked. I'd be allowed some moderate breaks. To be honest, as long as my section got finished and I wasn't late or belligerent, I was pretty much left alone to do my job. I spent the first few weeks acclimating to my new schedule and surroundings. A lot of time was spent learning the ropes, so to speak. Meeting other coworkers, learning what is expected of me, the ins and outs of taking inventory, as well as proper stocking etiquette. Yes, I said stocking etiquette. Such as don't block the aisles, refrain from leaving boxes strewn about. If a customer is attempting to get an item you are blocking, to move your cart out of the way completely. Apart from learning the job, I found the toughest transition to be the hours. Working the night shift can be somewhat daunting. Having to wake up when the sun is setting and coming home when the sun is rising takes some getting used to. Now, it's no secret that certain individuals frequently shop at Walmart. Even though customers come in all shapes and sizes, you do get some strange customers from time to time. From people dressed up in outrageous costumes to customers not dressed up in, well, anything. Hell, in my first week, a rather large gentleman walked up to me wearing nothing but those old school gym shorts. You know, the ones that are far too short for anyone to be wearing legally. He then demanded I tell him where the office supply department is. Why he's seeking the office supply department at 2 o'clock in the morning wearing gym shorts is beyond me. But that's not what this story's about. One night, after settling into my routine, I decided to take a much-needed break. Normally, there is a specific area for employees to take breaks, but me being a smoker, I usually took my breaks out back where the shipment trucks and dumpsters are. It's not the greatest of places, but it's quiet and beggars can't be choosers, am I right? I was standing out there, enjoying the peace and quiet, watching the light from the single street lamp bounce off the green sludge the dumpsters were leaking, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. From where I was standing, there were 2 semi-trucks side by side. I thought I saw someone or something duck between the two when I glanced over. Now, I know this goes against every horror movie ever made in the history of anything, but I called out to it. Hello? And just like in the movies, nothing responded. My mind first thought about a homeless junkie who was sleeping out back, but didn't want to have the police called on him for loitering. Then my imagination began to shift to a knife-wielding psychopath waiting for me to walk around that corner and slit my throat. Once that thought popped into my head, I quickly noped the hell out and went back inside. I went back to work and put the whole experience out of my mind. I put it out so far that I found myself going back outside again for my second break. It was around 4 a.m. and I was heading into the home stretch of my shift. As my hand rested upon the door is when that earlier experience came rushing back to me. After negotiating with myself that my need of nicotine was greater than my need to live, I pushed the door open and stepped outside. After walking outside, I instantly noticed something was wrong. The lone street lamp from before was off. Now, I had taken my breaks later in my shifts before when the sun was beginning to rise and the light outside would be turned off. But it was still pitch black outside. What I should have done was turn right back around and go back inside. But in a moment of tired confusion, I accidentally let the door behind me click shut. It was one of those external doors that are always locked from the outside to prevent thefts. Normally, I would just prop it open, but in my stupor, I forgot. Hearing that click, I felt my heart begin to beat faster. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it was only a 2-minute walk around the building to the front. So I stood there, in the dark, the only light emanating from the ember of my cigarette. Then I heard something that made the blood drain from my face. Footsteps, coming from the direction of the trucks. Slowly, I turned to look over in that direction. This time, I didn't say anything. I just stared. I found my eyes trying desperately to adjust to the darkness. After a moment, I could just make out the outline of the nearby truck. I attempted to comfort myself again by thinking it was just the homeless guy. Apart from the smoking, I'm actually in pretty decent shape, so unless the guy was a sumo wrestler, I figured I could handle myself in a fight. That's when I saw it. There was a part of the truck that was much darker than the rest of the metal. The dark spot stretched from the ground to near the top of the trailer. The shadow was in the shape of a man. There was a person standing next to the truck, and they were facing me. My fight or flight instinct took over, and I found myself doing something I never thought I would do in that situation. I shouted at whoever it was. "You got a problem, pal?" I said, trying to sound tough. I'm not sure what unnerved me more, the fact that it didn't respond or the fact that it remained motionless. For a brief moment, I thought the shadow that I was talking to was just some dark paint on the side of the truck. Then it moved. I watched it take a slow step towards me, and in that instant I almost screamed. The sudden movement made me jump back and thud against the door. I felt my throat constrict and my mind went blank. People always describe scary encounters as being frozen with fear. It wasn't that I couldn't move. It was just I couldn't remember how. I know it may sound strange, but I genuinely couldn't remember the most basic of functions, such as blinking. Watching this giant person grow closer to me made me feel like I was shrinking. I felt my eyes begin to water in response to not blinking. When my eyes finally couldn't take it anymore, they shut. In that nanosecond, my eyes were closed. This thing had closed the distance to me and was now about 3 feet away. I could see it much more clearly now. Its body was tall, but incredibly thin, like this creature hadn't eaten in years. Its appendages were equally as long as its torso. The skin on its body was like charred meat, almost like it was covered in ash. I didn't want to look up at its face, but my eyes drifted up without my consent. Its eyes were paler than my skin at that point. Seeing them up close, they almost glowed against the darkness. Its mouth was jagged and dripping some type of oozing liquid. What scared me the most was how utterly quiet it was, like it was some sort of hunter stalking its prey. Even at this distance, if I wasn't already aware of its presence, I probably wouldn't have seen it. Suddenly, it raised its bony arm towards me. The arm was almost long enough to reach me from where it stood. Whether it was instincts or watching too many martial arts movies, my brain suddenly came back online. I swatted its arm away and took off as fast as I could to get around the building. The entire time I sprinted around the building, I felt as if its fingers were grasping at the back of my neck. My lungs started to burn. I wanted to throw up. And if that thing touched me, I probably would have destroyed my pants. Rounding the corner, I crashed into a late-night customer's shopping cart, sending the contents flying. I quickly scrambled to my feet and looked behind me. I was alone. Well, alone with a very angry customer. My supervisor was, for lack of a better word, pissed. He scolded me, replaced the products for the customer, and demanded an explanation. At the risk of blaming my situation on a monster, I told him I was simply locked out and ran around to the front. That I wasn't paying attention and ran into the customer accidentally. For the most part, I was technically telling the truth. I didn't stick around at that job for much longer. I ended up finding a decent desk job uploading sales data for a local company. It's a strict job and very boring, but the pay is great and I don't have to work at night. I'm not sure if it was just my bad luck that the creature came after me, or if it simply likes to hang outside of stores when it's completely dark outside. But I'll never go to a Walmart at 4 a.m. ever again. And I would advise you all to do the same. I'm not saddened by the recent passing of my grandfather. Rather, I'm compelled to share the way I knew him best. I would not be here today if not for him. The entity came for me when I was 8 years old, and there was no way I would have survived if anyone else had been driving. My grandfather and I were on a fishing trip that day. My dad had intended to join us, but something came up, so it was just the two of us for the first time. I was a little awkward around my grandfather because I never actually been alone with him before. I had always watched others interact with him, but had little to say myself because, after all, I was only 8. I was also in awe of how he was to my dad the way my dad was to me, namely, a voice of authority. When my grandfather told me about the different types of fish and what baits to use, I listened like it was the most important thing in the world. It turned out to be a good thing that I took his words so seriously. That acceptance would later save my life. It began very innocuously, as we walked through a small gorge to get back to the car from the prime fishing spot. I could hear my grandfather's voice echo from the high rock walls. While he packed things into the car, I had several minutes to wander around, and I used them to run back to that area and shout. Strangely, my yell echoed only feebly once, and then not at all. Scream as I might, I heard no reflection of the noise. I was too young at the time to really understand how impossible that was. I just assumed I was yelling wrong somehow, or that my grandfather had a special grown-up timbre that allowed his voice to echo, while mine just dropped off. Still, it bothered me, and I eventually brought it up on the drive back. Everything about that moment became seared into my memory. It was 3:22 in the afternoon, according to the clock in the car's dashboard. The sky was mostly clear with traces of white, and my grandfather's eyes were wide orbs of alarm, turned upon me, while his white knuckles tightened around the wheel.
What did you say, boy?
I asked how I can echo like you. I told him, suddenly afraid that I had done something wrong. I yelled and I couldn't echo. His face was normally crisscrossed with little lines that ran their way along relaxed, droopy skin. At that very moment, his forehead and cheeks tightened to smoothness, and he scanned left to right rapidly. He didn't seem to find what he was looking for through the windows, but he did not seem reassured.
Here.
He leaned over and opened the glove box in front of me, and pulled out a bag of jelly beans. I smiled for a moment, but he was not giving them to me as a gift the way he had intended.
Go on, eat 'em.
I held the bag in my hands. It seemed a massive feast. If I had been left alone to my own devices, I might have eaten them all eventually, but not all at once. Why?
I said eat 'em.
he said gruffly, his tone brooking no argument. I began stuffing the jelly beans into my mouth. He looked down and around, then at the back seat, and then at his travel thermos and the cup holder between us. He thrust it into my hands to join the spilling bag of jelly beans.
Drink this. All of it.
I'm not allowed to have coffee, I told him. Mom, he cut me off.
Your mother will understand. Drink it. I know it tastes bad, but down it all.
His gaze then refocused on something beyond me, and I turned my head to my window to see the forested hills rolling by at various apparent speeds based on their distance. The furthest hills out on the horizon hardly seemed to be moving at all, but I thought I saw a tiny little speck atop one. My grandfather gripped my shoulder with one hand.
Drink, boy, drink! And eat those jelly beans too. You need the sugar and caffeine. It's going to try to make you fall asleep. Don't let it.
To say I was scared then would be an understatement. No part of me thought this was a prank of some sort. He was too reserved a man for that. And the coffee tasted terrible, but I gulped it down until none was left. After that, I began swallowing jelly beans whole until they were all gone. I looked to my right. The speck in the distance was still out there, but now one range of hills closer. It was still tiny, but now held movement, akin to something waving back and forth. I looked to my grandfather in askance. He in turn looked away from the thing in the distance to focus on my face. He breathed in through his nose and then turned forward, determined in a way I had never seen him. His leg moved, and the car began to accelerate. We had already been going the speed limit on the empty highway. The sugar, caffeine, and fear began to have an effect on me. I remember my cheeks and forehead warming and my hands growing clammy. I asked my grandfather, "What's going on? I'm scared."
Be scared,
he breathed, his eyes on the road as he continued to hit the gas. I could see the needle passing 80.
That'll keep you awake. This thing, this godforsaken thing, it came after your grandmother, and it started the same way. Just before a long drive, we noticed her voice stopped echoing.
His face contorted into a furious mask.
But cars are a lot better now than they were back then. I won't let it get you.
My back began forcefully pressing into my seat as he put the gas to the floor. I watched the needle pass 90, and then I looked out the window again. It was even closer, now visible as the silhouette of a man running up hills, between trees, and over boulders parallel to us. It's still out there. My grandfather grunted angrily and audibly slammed his foot down. I held onto my armrest and the door handle in terror as our car topped 100 miles an hour and began to shake. It felt like we were in a barely controlled projectile far beyond any limit of safety, and I was terrified that the highway would suddenly stop being empty and we would smash into a car or truck ahead. But even through that overwhelming fear and adrenaline, a chilled tiredness began to seep up my spine. My eyes began to feel heavy, and I blearily looked out to my right. The shock woke me back up. It was on the gravel shoulder of the highway now, completely visible as a black humanoid silhouette running at incredible speed alongside our car. In that moving pitch darkness, I could see lit pinpoints that made it feel as if I was gazing into the night sky itself. The afternoon sun burned in the sky above and behind it with no effect, staring as its blurred feet began to pelt across the painted line at the edge of the road. I felt sleepy again. It was running next to us, but drawing ever closer.
Wake up!
My grandfather screamed, risking one hand off the wheel at 110 miles an hour to shake my shoulder.
It's trying to drain the life out of you. Wake up!
He jerked the car one lane to the left and still pressed into my seat by the acceleration. I stared down at the hypnotic dashes in the middle of the road. Bit by bit, black feet began landing between each dash, keeping pace with us. I remember the car shaking violently around me, the way I imagined a space shuttle lifting off might shake around its astronauts. I know now we were crossing 120 and nearing the most the car could offer. But at the time, I was caught in watching the hypnotic dashes and stars and those void legs rapidly moving back and forth as it ran right up alongside the car and reached down with one hand to open the door. Wind blasted around me as the gale force of 120-mile-an-hour winds tore at my clothing and hair. Waking up halfway, I screamed, and my grandfather jerked the car to the left again as much as he could without going off the road. It didn't matter. The running silhouette held open the door against the wind with its star-filled arm and began preparing to leap into the car with us. The other arm gripped my neck, and the coldness that it brought cannot be described with mere words. The closest I can come to say is that the vast speeds and forces of an antithesis cosmos hated me. Somewhere, ice and anti-life were the rule, moving through emptiness at absurd velocities. And this thing was some small part of that undead will. But it was not fully here. It could only interact with us in certain windows. That's what I believe now. My grandfather gave the only shout of fear I would ever hear from him as the car seemed to shake apart around us. I turned left and looked at the speedometer, finding the needle to be unreadably far into the red, and felt the heavy blanket of sleep fall over me as the silhouette grasped at me repeatedly, but failed to reach me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, cutting off the wind. Inch by inch, we began pulling away. It ran furiously alongside, but the entity was just a tiny bit too slow between one moment and the next, realizing it couldn't get to us. It vanished. We had escaped it. I awoke in a hospital several days later. My grandfather told nobody the real story, of course, but the doctors had plenty of diversion. Somehow, I had been drained of a number of vital electrolytes, salts, and so on, and they chalked my mild coma up to some sort of severe dietary imbalance. But I knew the truth. And I've made sure to tell people I care about the small piece of advice my grandfather taught me. I don't care if it makes sense to you. Please just listen. It's still out there. Still in the open lands of the Midwest. And it's probably always been there. It was just never a problem before we started bringing great speeds into our daily lives. People die every day by falling asleep at the wheel. And I know for certain that not all of those incidents are innocent. So if your voice stops echoing, cancel your road trip. It's waiting for you. It all started in the summer of 2015. As I got up and prepared for work, I went to check on my 7-year-old daughter Grace in her room. I saw that she was laying in bed with her eyes closed, breathing softly. I found that odd, as she usually is up pretty early prancing around at 5 a.m. It was nearly 10:30, and she was still fast asleep. I figured that maybe she was just more tired than usual, and thus I didn't bother trying to wake her. I just kissed her forehead and then went downstairs to where my wife Lisa was making breakfast. I told her how Grace was still in bed, which Lisa agreed was quite unusual for her. "Promise you'll make some breakfast for her when she wakes up?" I asked. She agreed to do so. After kissing my wife goodbye, I grabbed my briefcase, got in my car, and drove straight to work. While I was there, I completely forgot about what happened with my daughter. It wasn't until 6 p.m. that my wife texted me, telling me that Grace was still asleep after nearly 8 hours. I texted her back, jokingly typing, "Have you thought about renaming her Sleeping Beauty?" To which she responded with a text angrily saying that this wasn't a joke. She was seriously considering calling an ambulance at that very moment. I told her not to worry about it, that kids get unusually sleepy from time to time. If she was still asleep after 24 hours, then we could start worrying. Sure enough, the next day, Grace was still in her bed, still breathing softly like she was the previous morning. We did everything we could to wake her up. Everything from shaking her to blowing an air horn in her face. But nothing worked. We desperately called the hospital. In no time at all, an ambulance arrived to take her away. The doctors called and told us that there didn't appear to be anything wrong with Grace. She showed all the regular signs of being asleep. However, since she showed no signs of waking up anytime soon, they told us that they would just hold on to her for a while, and we could come visit her whenever we wanted. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Grace continued her permanent slumber. The doctors fed her using one of those feeding tubes they use for coma patients. Lisa and I grew more and more concerned. Neither of us could eat or sleep. We just wanted to see our little girl up and active again, like she was supposed to be. We spoke to her every time we visited her, silently hoping she could respond. In February, we celebrated her 8th birthday in the hospital, and wished she could be awake to eat the delicious cake and ice cream she loved so much. One day, approximately a year after Grace's permanent slumber began, I was taking a picture of her to share on my Facebook. All of a sudden, I heard her cry out,
"Daddy!"
Lisa and I jumped with excitement, thinking that our daughter was finally awake and we could finally hug and talk to her. We were just about to debate how to break it to her that she lost an entire year of her life, when we saw that she was once again lying down with her eyes closed, breathing softly. We stared at her for a few minutes, wondering if what we heard was our own imaginations, when she shouted again,
"Mommy! Daddy! Help!"
We called the doctor into the room. After hearing her cry out one more time, he told us that she was simply talking in her sleep, which many people do when they're dreaming. So Lisa and I tried our best to shrug it off. We continued to visit her after this incident, and every time we did, our daughter would continue to shout and cry in her sleep. To this day, I still remember everything she said in exact detail.
"Help! He's got me! Let me go! Help! I'm stuck! Help me!"
It disturbed us so much that we started visiting her less and less over time. Now I can't even look at a picture of Grace without hearing her screams in the back of my head. I can't help but wonder what could have possibly trapped my daughter in her own dreams, and if it'll find any other victims once it's done with my daughter. I may not have to look too far though. Today, my wife has been asleep much longer than usual. A full 24 hours to be exact. Growing up, I was convinced I'd be abducted by aliens. I lived in constant, sleep-deprived fear as every strange shadow and every reflection of light on the wall signified the beginning of what I knew would be my end. Logic told me the shadows were just piles of dirty clothes or my coat rack, that the reflections were just from passing cars on the street below. But logic always fails in the face of terror. If it weren't for my older brother Jason, with whom I shared the bedroom, there was a very real chance I probably would have lost my mind. I remember my 13th birthday with the same detached sense of helpless violation as a victim of trauma. The day itself had been fine. Pleasant, even. My parents, who were always caring and supportive, did their best to make sure my birthday was enjoyable. They knew I was stressed. They knew I was anxious. I'd never told them why, though. Only Jason knew, and he promised to keep it a secret. After the festivities, I went up to my room to play video games. I had 2 hours to play before lights out. Jason sat on his immaculately made bed, which was in stark contrast to my messy one, and watched, offering pointers as I died over and over again. 2 hours went by quickly, and Dad came in to say it was time to go to sleep. He sat next to Jason on the bed, and let me know he was proud of me. How I had been brave despite having a hard time and that things would get better. He wished me a happy birthday, and kissed me goodnight, switching off the light on his way out of the room. For a little while, I felt pretty good. Like I said, I never told my parents exactly what had been bothering me. They'd ask every so often, but they wouldn't pry. They could tell I was struggling. I heard them cleaning downstairs, comforted by the fact that they were still awake and alert. With a sense of security I hadn't felt in a long time, I drifted off to sleep. After a couple hours, I woke up and glanced at the clock. 11:26. I closed my eyes again. Before I could drift off to sleep, though, I noticed something. The room smelled bad. It wasn't a scent I could identify in the slightest. It was heavy and medicinal, but organic too. It was strange. Alien. My eyelids lifted to the sight of something shuffling towards my bed. I tried to shout and bolt away, but nothing worked. No movement, no sound. Only my eyes could receive my commands. And they stared, bulging out of my skull, as something stood over my frozen body. I knew it had finally come to me. This was the day I had anticipated and dreaded for years. I tried to make out the features on its face. All I could pick up on was hideousness, deformity, a head with its upper left quadrant missing, a mouth with no lower mandible, and a shriveled tongue lolling down to its skinny neck.
Robbie.
It gurgled. It knew my name. It had been studying me, and it knew my name.
No more me, Robbie. No more me. Time to grow up.
Its head came down and touched my forehead with the remains of its upper lip. As it tilted, maggots tumbled out of the cratered skull and landed on my face. They squirmed and tumbled onto my pillow. I felt them writhing against my ears and the sides of my neck.
I'll miss you.
It turned and walked towards Jason's bed. I tried over and over to scream as panic suffused the entirety of my being. The dark world around me blurred and I knew I was going to pass out. I knew I was going to fail my brother and not be able to warn him before the creature reached him. Before I lost consciousness, before I passed into a dreamless morass of black. I hated myself for being so useless, for being so weak. My mother's shrill, panicked shriek catapulted me back into reality. The room was bright. It was morning. My mother stood over Jason's bed, wailing and sobbing, and I heard Dad thundering across the hall from their bedroom. He burst into the room and immediately saw what Mom did. I watched his knees tremble, as if they were about to give out. I didn't move. Everything from the previous night was coming back, and I knew, I was certain, Jason was dead. My big brother was gone. The certainty was overwhelming, and searing tears of pain leaked down my cheeks and onto my pillow. Something wriggled against my neck. I gasped and leapt to my feet. Everything went slowly for the next few minutes. I turned and saw the ring of maggots around my headprint on the pillow. Dad was crossing the room to take me in his arms when he saw the bugs on my pillow and in my hair and whispered,
Oh my God.
He picked me up. He hadn't done that in years. I rode out of the room, clasped within his arms.
"Don't look at your brother's bed," he ordered.
But I couldn't help myself. I looked as we exited. One glance was all I needed. Jason's body was on the bed. He was wearing a stained and dirt-encrusted blue shirt. Oh no, I thought to myself as I took in his injuries. The torn lower mandible, the caved-in skull, the desiccated, green-gray skin that was mostly gone. Mom's racking sobs had escalated into hysterical screaming. Dad whispered into my ear as we walked.
"Shh, it's okay. We don't know who did it, but it's going to be all right. It's not your brother anymore. It's just the body he doesn't need. He's still in heaven, okay? He's still in heaven."
I started to shake, and Dad's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke those last words.
"He's in heaven."
It sounded horribly, horribly familiar. I closed my eyes and saw a coffin. I saw my parents standing next to it, sobbing. I saw a large, framed picture of Jason in a room full of friends and family. But I also saw the toys I was playing with. And I saw Jason sitting next to me. We played while everyone else cried. He grinned and said, "Don't be upset, Robbie. I'll be here to help you while you grow up. You don't have to feel sad." My Aunt Lindsay came up to me and stood in the exact same spot where Jason was sitting. I remember thinking it was strange she could do that. And then she knelt down and said, "He's in heaven," before walking back to my cousins and uncle. Jason winked at my confused face. Then we kept playing with our toys. "Jason died," I whispered to Dad. He nodded, and I watched as he eyed the muddy footprints from the back door which led down the hall and up the stairs to my room.
"You were probably too young to remember, but he loved you so much."
I thought back to all the fun we had in our room over the years, all leading up to video games on my 13th birthday the night before.
"You're the same age he was now,"
Dad said, and tears freely flowed down onto his beard.
"You're all grown up."
Something from the previous night buzzed in my ears. No more me, Robbie. No more me. Time to grow up. And then it clicked. My brother had been dead this whole time, watching over me until I was all grown up. Jason wanted to say goodbye one last time. Upon realizing this, my screams joined those of my mother in a terrible, dissonant chorus. When we were young, my brothers and I shared a room. Those two were great at making shadow puppets come to life. Tyler could make a soaring hawk, and John a fearsome wolf. Me? I was never able to make anything that looked remotely like anything. Before you start harking on me and telling me how easy it is and I should have at least been able to make a bunny, keep in mind that John can't snap his fingers, so I'm not the only failure in the family. My brothers never made me feel bad about my shortcomings, but I felt a little sad all the time. I'd watch as they'd tell stories with their shadow puppets, and wait to join in on the games of shadow tag we'd play until one of us fell asleep. Everything changed when we moved to a bigger house. We all got our own bedrooms, mine being the smallest since I was the youngest. And our nightly games came to an end. I'd practice making shadow puppets on my own in the hopes that I would eventually learn and impress my brothers. But no matter how hard I tried, I never really got any better. One night, I had stayed awake practicing later than usual, knowing my brothers and I were going to have a weekend sleepover. I was exhausted, my head bobbing and my eyelids drooping. But something suddenly snapped me awake. A shadow crept into view from below. Much like my own shadow puppets, it wasn't a distinctive shape. It was an upright, large oval with 8 little tentacles wiggling out of the top. I managed to mimic it by bringing my hands together and crisscrossing my fingers. The shape bloomed like a flower, opening wide and then snapping shut. It kind of reminded me of a Venus flytrap. Thinking it was one of my brothers hiding under my bed, I called out, "Tyler?" No reply. "John?" Still nothing. "It's not very funny, guys," I whimpered. The shape opened and closed twice. I pulled my blanket up to my neck and slowly pushed myself to the edge of the bed. Even though I fully anticipated I'd find one of my brothers hiding under there waiting to jump out at me, even though I was ready for it, I was still nervous and tense. It was like watching the villain of a horror movie slowly creep towards its victim, knowing full well what's going to happen, but still being anxious at the same time, you know? The fear was palpable. I could feel my heart thrashing and throbbing like a trout out of water. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and looked under the bed. There was nothing there. Just dust bunnies and the robot toy I had lost earlier that week. I tilted my head back up and looked at the wall. The shadow puppet was still there, snapping its maw open and shut over and over again. Then, suddenly, it darted closer to my shadow, and I quickly pulled my torso back onto the mattress and shut off the light, and I hid under my blanket until I passed out. Come morning, I just dismissed it as being a bad dream. That night, I showed off the cool Venus flytrap shadow puppet I learned to make thanks to that nightmare. "The heck is that supposed to be?" complained Tyler. John laughed. "Lame." The L word. They weren't pulling any punches. I couldn't have felt any more uncool if I was forced to go to school with suspenders and braces. Still reeling from the soul-crushing roast I had received at the sleepover, I spent the rest of the week trying to perfect my craft, but I kept falling asleep before I had much time to practice. Then, one night, the buzz of my flashlight woke me up. I opened my eyes and saw its flickering halo on the wall, but didn't find it on my bed. It had somehow fallen onto the ground without waking me up. A weird shadow was slowly inching from one side of the illuminated circle to the other. It had long ears, a spindly body, and a morphed tail shaped like a question mark. I was petrified. And then, it grew smaller as the thing casting the shadow moved farther away from the source of the light and closer to the wall. My cat came into view and stared at me as though trying to say, "What the heck's your problem?" That would have been a great time to let out a string of expletives, but at that age, even in my most private of moments, I didn't dare utter those words. I was still at that age where I thought my mom literally had eyes in the back of her head and ears in the walls. Hell, I'm an adult now and I'm still not convinced she doesn't. My cat disappeared from view, but I could tell where she was based on her shadow. She began darting back and forth and pouncing on nothing in the way that cats tend to do for no good reason. Since she seemed to want to play, I stretched out my hand over the side of the bed and wiggled my fingers, unsure whether she'd go directly for them or their long shadow on the wall. She seemed torn between the two, at times throwing herself at the wall like a bird in a newly cleaned patio door, and at others nuzzling my fingertips. Then I stopped moving when I saw the Venus flytrap-like shadow emerging. At that point, my cat was out of view again. Her shadow showed her standing sideways, looking at the new shadow curiously. I heard her hiss and saw the hairs on her body rise like a mohawk. In one fell swoop, the Venus flytrap opened, darted towards her shadow, and snapped shut halfway through. I jumped and let out a yelp, and looked over the side of the bed. I wish I hadn't. I could have spared myself a lot of hurt if I just closed my eyes right then and there and pretended I hadn't seen anything. Instead, I have a mental image of it now. An image I'll never be able to wash from my mind until the day that I die. I should have known better when I saw only half of my cat's shadow being cast on the wall. But I looked anyways. I looked, and I saw her still twitching hind legs attached to the lower half of her body. Then, I watched as the Venus flytrap bit down on what was left of her shadow, and her body completely disappeared. Nothing was casting that shadow. I was looking at the floor the entire time. There was nothing there. I threw my blanket over the flashlight and cried myself to sleep. It took my parents about a week before they told us that our cat had gone missing. I didn't tell them the truth. I might have been a stupid kid who couldn't even make a proper shadow puppet. But I knew better than to say something about it. They'd think I was nuts or tell me I was dreaming. We put up posters and we went through the stages of grief. Tyler was angry at first. John refused to believe she was gone. As for me, I just felt numb. The secret weighed on me. But the fear of telling and the fear of the shadow in my room weighed even heavier. I began sleeping in complete darkness. No nightlights. No hallway lights. No half-open blinds. I was terrified of the shadows. The only place that was safe in the shadows was in the dark. Because the only thing that can cast a shadow is light. This went on for about a month before we had our next sleepover. And by then, pretty much everyone had accepted our cat wasn't coming back. It was late, but the three of us were wide awake from the plethora of Halloween candy we had snuck out of the kitchen when our parents weren't watching. I was afraid from the moment Tyler turned on the flashlight and proposed we make shadow puppets. No. I just want to sleep, I whispered, hoping he'd turn off the light. Tyler snorted. What are you, 5? Come on, man, let's play. John kicked me in the shin. I just don't want to, I croaked. So you'll be changing your name to Lame then, right? Said John. Just leave him alone, replied Tyler sternly. His voice softened as he addressed me. Look, if you want to sleep, then sleep, but we're playing. I closed my eyes tightly and turned away, trying to ignore them as Tyler's hawk and John's wolf flew around the room. They were laughing and making their shadow puppets fight each other. And then, they suddenly stopped. Don't do that, John scolded. Tyler replied, It's not me. David, stop, it's not funny. What? I replied. I was confused. I could tell they were upset, but I didn't know why. At least, not until I saw the feline shadow casually trotting from one flashlight's halo to the other. It pounced at Tyler's hawk and pawed at John's wolf, just like our cat used to do. I felt my stomach drop and bounce back, like my guts were made of bungee cord. I tried to tell them I wasn't projecting it. I tried to remind them that I sucked at shadow puppets. But they kept shouting at me to stop and getting more and more upset, until finally they turned off their flashlights. It's not funny, I heard John grumble. I'm going to sleep, added Tyler. I remember the way they looked at me the next morning. Their eyes were so full of animosity that I felt like a nerd trying to sit at the cool kids table. I think my mom talked to them later because they eventually stopped treating me like a leper and slowly started including me in their games again. Though they never did play shadow puppets again. At least, not with me. Eventually, we grew up, like people tend to do. John moved away, and our parents sold our house to Tyler so they could move into a smaller place. Tyler got married and had kids, and I became that weird person with a couple of cats and no social life. A few weeks ago, Tyler's wife called in a panic and asked if I had seen him. Long story short, he had gone missing without a trace. Sure, their marriage had been on the rocks for a few years, but I knew Tyler well enough to know he wouldn't leave his family behind. I drove over to their house, to my old house, and tried to help as much as I could. I knew right from the moment I stepped through the front door and saw his youngest daughter. I knew what happened. I immediately recognized that numb look in her eyes as my sister-in-law grimly welcomed me in. I slept in my niece's room that night, with a flashlight tucked under my arm just to be sure, while the kids slept with their mother. Once everyone was asleep and the house was quiet, I turned the flashlight on and waited. I found the Venus flytrap in a corner. A hawk flew across the ceiling, and my cat came running after it in an eternal game of shadow tag. The Suddenly Girls. Sure, I knew them. They roamed this school back when I was a student like yourselves, before I became the janitor here. Their names were Eliza, Beth, and Liz. As freshmen, they tried going by the 3 Elizabeths, but to everyone else, they quickly became the Suddenly Girls. Why? Well, at first they only irritated people. By the time they were seniors, however, they were hell on heels. When they sashayed down the hallway with their chins high and their hips rolling, other students would dive for cover, as Eliza, Beth, and Liz strode past like demonic supermodels. Pity the poor loser who didn't pay attention and stood in their way, for without pausing as they came up from behind, one of the girls would say something like, "And then suddenly, Ryan's books were all over the floor." Then the girls would jab Ryan with their elbows as they swept by. Making someone spill their books was the least of their offenses, but that was how they operated, see? One girl would suddenly call out an evil idea, and the other 2 would automatically pitch in to make it happen, almost like they shared one mind. Whether it was random or something they prepared, it was obvious they lived for cruel pranks. And then suddenly, every second-floor locker was filled with glitter. And then suddenly, the stairs and handrails were coated in WD-40. And then suddenly, right before the holidays, someone put dead fish in the vents. Sure, they got into fights. They got yelled at, reprimanded, and suspended. But the Suddenly Girls always took revenge, and their revenge was always devastating. They went to such extremes that even the teachers learned not to cross them. Me? Yeah. They even played a nobody like me once. I was in the library, finishing an algebra assignment when they appeared out of nowhere, fawning over me like nymphs. "Like my new necklace?" asked Eliza, exposing her cleavage. "What about my tattoo?" inquired Beth, sliding her jeans down to her hip bone. "How about my perfume?" asked Liz, bending very, very close to me. My eyes bulged, my mouth sputtered, my virgin teenage brain imploded. The girls just laughed at me. And then suddenly, Eliza said as they moved away, "You were alone again." And I was, alone, and mysteriously missing my algebra paper. Small wonder that after years of acting like monsters, the Suddenly girls were found dead. I expect you kids have heard the stories about Eliza, suffocated, with her throat stuffed with glitter. Beth, cooked with WD-40 and a lighter. And Liz, gutted like a fish. Their murders are still unsolved, but I have my suspicions. After all, I took this job right after graduation to save up for college. It was only available because the old janitor ran off before the police could question him. Makes you wonder, eh? Well, kids, you better get to class. But do me a favor. Please try to avoid making any messes. Remember, janitors are people too. And everybody has a breaking point. People like to make fun of me because one of my hands is slightly smaller than the other. They probably wouldn't laugh if they knew the story behind it. See, back in grade school, we used to hide out in this dark corner under the stairs at lunch and share horror stories. It was the perfect spot because it was naturally kind of spooky, and because it was out of sight from our teachers and hall monitors, who banned everything we ever liked, horror stories included. There was one tale Kevin MacLeod liked to tell the new kids. The story of Baxter baby hands. I'll never forget the first time I heard it, because I started laughing and MacLeod punched me in the face. Good times. As MacLeod's story goes, there was once an orphan named Baxter, who worked in a factory in town in the olden days. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for factories to employ kids to fix their machines whenever they got jammed, because they were smaller and could fit through the gears. Baxter had the smallest and most nimble hands out of all the kids working at this factory. So small, in fact, that they called him Baxter Baby Hands. He was the one they always called on to fix the big grinder near the back. One day, the foreman asked him to go pluck out a rock caught in the grinder's gears. Problem was, he had forgotten to turn the machine off. So, little Baxter walked over to this big machine and reached inside, yanking out the rock. As soon as he did, the gears started turning again, and Baxter's hands got crushed. They say his scream could be heard 2 towns over. Baxter survived, but his hands were gone forever. He was just a poor orphan kid, so the doctors didn't bother doing anything beyond patching him up. And of course, without hands, he couldn't work anymore. Back then, if you didn't work, you were useless. They say Baxter starved to death, holding out his mangled stumps like a homeless person begging for food. But any money anyone might have thrown his way slipped between the fingers he no longer had. A few days passed, and then one night, the factory foreman woke up to something small and soft against his cheek. At first, he thought it was his wife's hand. But as it came in for another stroke, he realized it was much, much smaller, about the size of a child's. He opened his eyes and saw Baxter leaning over him, with itty-bitty hands growing out of his stumps. His wife found the foreman the next day, dead, with both of his hands cut off. Over the course of the next 15 years, every single person, adult and child, who had been working at the factory the day Baxter lost his hands, wound up dead, with their own hands missing. The townsfolk, worried they'd be next, ordered his pauper's grave to be dug up and his body to be burned. When they opened his grave, however, they got far more than they bargained for. Inside was the rotting corpse of Baxter, with the foreman's hands sewn onto his stumps, and all the hands he had collected sewn onto each of the fingers. They were shriveled up like shrunken heads, looking almost as small as baby hands. Horrified, the townsfolk burned Baxter and his multiple hands then and there, hoping once and for all to end the curse. That's how the legend of Baxter Baby Hands began. Some say one of the villagers took one of his baby hands as a souvenir before they burned him, so part of Baxter is still out there to this day. And another rumor to go along with this legend was that if you whisper Baxter Baby Hand's name in the mirror 3 times before going to bed, he'll appear and touch you with his multiple tiny hands. If he likes how your skin feels, he'll rip off one of your hands and add it to his own collection. Farland looked dead serious every time he told the story. Over the years, he'd even add to it and embellish it, saying his uncle had tried to summon Baxter Baby Hands and his great-great-great-grandfather was the foreman. I never believed the story myself, not until I decided to prove them all wrong by summoning Baxter Baby Hands myself. I asked a friend to be a witness, and I recited his name 3 times in his mirror before walking back home and going to bed. I never in a million years expected anything to come of it. I've played with Ouija boards and tried the Bloody Mary thing many times without even so much as getting a bad feeling. I was convinced nothing would happen. But I was wrong. I don't know at what time of night it happened, but I know I was in a pretty deep sleep when I felt something touch my face. It wasn't enough to wake me up with a start, but it did stir me out of my slumber. It was a very light, soft touch against my cheeks. At first, I thought it was my curtains swaying in the breeze, so I ignored it, and I rolled over. The gentle touch followed me as I rolled across the bed, and that's when I became concerned. I tried to open my eyes, but as soon as I did, I felt something small hold my eyelids down by force. Next, I tried to scream, but the same thing happened to my lips. Whatever was touching me slowly ran up and down my cheeks in gentle yet violating facial caresses. It spread from my cheeks to my forehead and chin, going from soft strokes to firm kneading, like a cat's paw except without the claws. I was paralyzed with fear, barely able to breathe as it happened. I couldn't call for my parents. Hell, I couldn't even see what was happening to me. I don't think I'll ever be that scared again in my life. The touching of my face continued for at least 10 minutes, as though it was being assessed, but I'm not sure to what end. Then, the pressure on my eyelids let up, and I was able to open my eyes. What I saw then defied all logic. There were blurry fingers everywhere and going in every direction. As they pulled away from my face, they came into focus, and the millions of little fingers became about 50. They were tiny fingers on tiny hands. Baxter's hands. Each little hand was attached to another little hand that wiggled and bowed like those of a puppeteer. One finger remained downcast, the small hand at its end holding my mouth shut. Every digit, small and large alike, seemed to move of its own volition, yet were all tied to a single source controlling them. The source was a man, standing behind the veil of fingers. He was short for his age, and wore rags that looked 3 times too small. They were stretched out as though he had slowly grown out of them, but never bothered changing into something better suited for him. As for his face, I honestly don't remember it. My eyes were too busy looking at the hypnotic mess of his many hands. It was hard to focus on anything else. Baxter smiled and pulled his right hand closer to his face. All 6 of the index fingers on it rose up to shush me as he released my mouth. I didn't know what to think, but I knew better than to scream. Something told me that something very bad would happen if I screamed. He then reached for his left hand and ripped it off his arm. It came off with a pop. No blood. Very little resistance. Like a carrot being plucked out of the soil. His right hand, or rather, hands, gripped my left tightly. They pulled at my hand so hard that I started crying soundlessly. The pressure on my hand was immense, like being the rope in a tug of war. Suddenly, I heard a sickening rip, and I lost all feeling in that hand. I didn't want to look down, but my eyes did it on their own. My left hand was gone, and in its place was just a smooth stump. I tried to scream, but a pair of small hands quickly pushed my lips together until I could only groan. I then watched as Baxter pressed his severed hand against my bloodless stump, and I felt a prickling sensation as the small veins on it reached into my skin and connected with mine. I could feel the hand, and within minutes I could even wiggle its fingers. The sensation was beyond bizarre. I knew it wasn't mine. It felt different, but I had control of it. Baxter then put my left hand where he had removed his own. It attached and began shriveling up to the size of a small hand. Without a single word, he turned around and walked out of my bedroom door. I was beyond horrified. I just sat there in shock and watched the tiny hand at the foot of my wrist. It started to grow as I watched it. Within a couple hours, it was almost the size of my normal hand. But it never quite made it all that way. Now, people make fun of me for my little hand. They say I'm a freak. I mean, if you didn't know it, you probably wouldn't even notice it. But if I put my hands together, you can tell my fingers are half an inch too short, and my hand just isn't quite as wide. I know, somewhere out there, Baxter Baby Hand still has it. And I know people are still stupid enough to try summoning him. Want to know how I know? Well, sometimes late at night, I can feel my fingertips gently caressing someone's face. But my hands are both next to me, firmly holding on to my pillow. My mother called me a few days ago. She was crying and reminded me that it was her brother Brian's birthday. I was surprised to hear that name. She hadn't talked about him in so long that I had completely forgotten what had happened. When I told this story to my buddy, he mentioned that the internet loves creepy government stuff. So, here's the tale of my family's dark mystery. I'll tell you what I know first, and then I'll tell you how I know. My Uncle Brian was a scrubber for a private company contracted with the US government. His job, or the job of his entire team rather, was to retrieve or destroy secret, top secret, and alleged above top secret data from sunken military vessels. This included anything from documents, storage drives, cargo, weaponry, dog tags, identification cards, and even corpses. He would also scrub identifying marks on ships, strip indicators of country of origin, and salvage valuable parts of the craft. His duties were not limited to these, but these are the most interesting and relevant. Brian performed deep-sea dives between 1969 and 71, then again from 1980 to 81. We don't know much about his life between those two periods, but we do know that he was stationed at a training facility somewhere in the Arctic Circle, probably Greenland or Canada. During that time, he only visited his home in Arizona for 6 weeks per year, and was forbidden from doing all kinds of weird things. He was not allowed to purchase office supplies or typewriters. Could not spend money at all except with a checkbook issued to him by his employer. Could not go into a bank for any reason. Could not handle cash. Could not go to large gatherings or drink alcohol, etc. They wouldn't even let him smoke cigarettes. He was forbidden to write anything down and therefore would never handle a pencil. Couldn't talk about his job, and refused to even touch a phone, with one exception. Brian had to call a phone number every 6 hours, regardless of the time of day. He would wake up in the middle of the night to make the call, which always pissed off his wife. Whenever he made that call, he always spoke casually, as if talking to an old friend, and had conversations that never mounted to more than idle chit-chat. I only heard these calls once in my life, and only in retrospect did I realize that they were heavily coded. What he was actually saying, we will never know. Even when someone called for Brian, he wouldn't take the phone. He would only touch it or speak if he himself dialed the number. I've never seen such a paranoid person in my entire life. But in my young age, I found his behavior harmless and amusing. My uncle mysteriously disappeared in 1999, when I was 12 years old. I had only met him twice, and by that time he was retired. I was too young to remember him the first time we had met. But the second occasion I actually tried to block out and pretty much have, until this conversation with my mom. When we visited him for a week in Phoenix, he was glum the entire time. The man was singularly unfriendly, and appeared scarcely aware of anything but his own private thoughts. He was more pensive and withdrawn than anyone I had ever known, as if he had retreated entirely from this planet and left a functioning body behind. He looked over his shoulder all the time, even on the couch, and always watched the rearview mirror when Mom drove us out to dinner. I remember him constantly doing weird things, such as inspecting the light switches in his home, unscrewing the little plates and poking around, then putting them back on. He looked up in the air each time he walked outside, as if he expected a brick to fall on his head, or maybe perhaps a helicopter to snap a photo of him. He only ever spoke in short and stilted sentences, cautious not to divulge anything that could get him into trouble. Brian seemed like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders, and a flood of confessions just behind the dam of his teeth. I found myself wondering about him each night as I tried to fall asleep. One night during that visit, Brian snapped. I don't know what caused it, but he had a massive freakout and started acting like he was on hard drugs. In the middle of a normal conversation on the couch, he started shrieking about how he was sick of all the games and didn't want to be a gerbil anymore. To my mother's horror, he lunged at me and tried to strangle me. He kept screaming to my mother that he was going to twist the head off and show you all the circuits, and went on and on about how there were cameras in my eyes and microphones in my ears. He bit me, and when he saw that I bled, he snapped out of the episode and burst into tears. My mom tried to call 911 from the house, but for some reason it wouldn't connect. She frantically dialed the number on his barren fridge, and a woman answered. My mom told her that Brian was acting crazy, and said that she needed police and an ambulance. The woman told my mom that she'd phone Brian's doctor immediately, and that everyone should just sit tight. I refused to go to the hospital anyways. I'm a lifelong emetophobe, and hospitals make me nauseous. In less than an hour, a man showed up at the door. He called himself Dr. S. The doctor was dressed in ordinary slacks and a button-down shirt, and had a clean shave. I remember noticing the roughness of his hands when he shook mine. He was big, but too well-spoken to be some bruiser. I have trouble explaining what I mean, but the plainness of his appearance and the calmness of his demeanor felt very menacing to me. like he was about to murder every person in the house, Patrick Bateman style. The thing I remember most about him, however, was that he carried the acrid stench of chemicals, as if he had been varnishing wood or something. The doctor had a quiet conversation with my uncle on the back patio, and then he politely excused himself and left. He told my mom and I that Brian is going to be fine, that he just needs some rest. He said he ordered a prescription and that we can pick it up for him tomorrow. When my mother asked if it was dangerous to be alone with him, the doctor just laughed and said, "Not anymore. I promise." He squeezed my shoulder and walked away. Two things really disturbed me about Dr. S's visit. The first was that between hello and goodbye, the man wasn't there any longer than 4 minutes. What could he possibly have said to Brian in that amount of time? And second, when I ran upstairs to watch the doctor drive away, he didn't get into a car. He literally walked out of the neighborhood. Brian immediately seemed better after his meeting with the doctor. He apologized to me and ate dinner with us. He was in much higher spirits, like he had been relieved of every burden he carried. My mom and I slept in the guest room, with the door locked that night, simply because we had no idea what to expect from him. Brian was like his precious light switches, on or off, with nothing in between. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to my mother shouting. The house was dark. The patio door was wide open. And Brian was gone. He didn't take anything with him. Not his shoes or his checkbook or his watch. His car still sat in the garage, and his keys on the counter. We tried to call the number on the fridge, but the line was disconnected. The phone wouldn't even dial out anymore at all. Early the next morning, a bunch of men showed up to the house. They took all Brian's possessions away in boxes, and asked my mom and I a ton of really strange, nonsensical questions. Things like, did Brian ever tell you his favorite color? What food does he hate the most? Is he good with kids? Did he ever go to church? What is your earliest memory of him? Was he right or left-handed? The interrogation left us baffled. I was really confused by all of this. But my mother was downright mortified. No matter what answer she gave, they always doubted her, and told her she must be wrong, and gave some ridiculous explanation as to why. On the other hand, they never questioned a single thing I said. I still don't understand what the point of all that was. Almost a year later, after the shock of his disappearance began to settle into a dull pain, my mother decided to sell her car. When she did, she stumbled across something strange. Under the floor of the trunk, tucked into the spare tire, she found a VHS tape. It was from Brian. He probably left it there while we were asleep. In it, Brian was standing way out in the desert somewhere. He looked a few years younger, and appeared to have not slept in days. He described the nature of his work to my mom, and some of the things he had seen and done. I pieced together everything I know about him from this tape and some conversations between my mom and Brian's ex-wife. I haven't seen the tape since we found it, and I'm sure my mom got rid of it, as Brian instructed. But here are the things I remember best. The weirdest and scariest things he found while working on sunken ships and submarines. Rooms that remained pressurized, where people appeared to live for weeks after the submarine sank. Some of the sailors appeared to have lost their minds and wrote all over the walls or killed each other. Loud banging sounds on the hull and in passageways. These wrecks were mostly from World War II and the Cold War, some even Vietnam, so years or decades old. But Brian swore he heard SOS and Morse code on more than one occasion. He even claims he once heard leave. Frozen bodies that looked mummified, suspended in the wrecks with smiles on their faces. The skin freezes and flakes off, revealing an eerie grin. The body of a young woman who appeared to have died much more recently than anyone else on the ship. She was wearing a flowing white dress and looked like an angel when Brian found her. She wasn't desiccated like the other bodies. Her skin was pristine, despite being locked in a British submarine that sunk in the 1940s and now lays at the bottom of the North Sea. Strange things on Soviet ships, human experiments, fetuses in bottles, remains that looked both human and animal, cages, chains, extensive prison networks in the bowels of one nuclear-class icebreaker in the Arctic, etc. Brian claims he found the body of what looked like a baby floating in a laboratory, but its limbs were 2 to 3 feet long and dangled together like a dead wasp's. When he moved it, it broke apart and dissipated in the water. Very few bones at all. Brian talked about discovering a passenger jet that had never been reported missing. It crashed into the ocean and sank. All of the corpses were still buckled into their seats. The unusual thing was that the jet had sunken next to an old ship, and the corpses on the jet all wore dog tags that were traced back to that ship. It was as if someone had played a practical joke by moving the dog tags. But my 12-year-old mind imagined the corpses of the ship walking across the seafloor and buckling themselves into the crashed jet, hoping it would take them back to their families. He also talked about scrubbers going mad in the depths. 2 of Brian's friends went missing during a dive off of the Alaskan coast. One of them was found sealed in a room of the submarine they were exploring, a door that could only be locked from the outside. He was nearly dead of hypothermia and swore that a woman without a face had put him in there. The other managed to remove a small part of his helmet, instantly killing himself because of the pressure difference. Those were just some of the things he touched on in the video. There's more, and I'll try to remember or ask my mother if anyone else is interested. In the years after Brian's disappearance, strange men visited me once in a while, always asking about Brian. They found me in random places and always asked random questions. They were always polite, but they never identified themselves. No matter where my mom and I moved, they always found us. One time, a substitute teacher showed up to my high school biology class in senior year and gave the standard lecture. But at the end of the day, he asked me if I had any relatives who worked for the government, and if I could remember what my uncle's favorite color was. On another occasion in college, my then girlfriend, now fiance, and I went to a bar for a friend's birthday, and the bartender kept trying to serve me alcohol. I don't drink. And then asked me if I had ever considered moving to Phoenix. He told me his buddy Brian used to live out there, and asked me if I had ever gone scuba diving before. At the end of the night, he asked me how my mother was doing, and even used her full name. Most recently, while jogging the forest trail near my house in California, a guy on a bicycle stopped me and told me I looked just like a guy he used to know. Brian, a dude he met in the Navy. He mentioned that they lost touch and said, "Last I heard, he was out living in the desert or something, far away from the ocean. Man, he always hated the ocean." I replied sarcastically that he probably went to Phoenix, and the guy's expression went cold as a dead fish. He said, "That's right. He's happier there, I'm sure of it." Then the man rode off. The one thing all of these people had in common was that they reeked of chemicals, just like Dr. S. Brian's ex-wife Jill once told me, "Your uncle had brain bubbles," and told me that the crazy things he'd say were the result of brain damage from diving. The mixture of gases, pressure, and tight spaces coupled with the stressors of the job, could certainly do real harm to a person's mind. But then again, Jill also worked in the government. That's how they met. And after Brian disappeared, she acted like she barely remembered him at all. It was almost as though she wanted me to dismiss him as a nut job. And now that I think about it, she always smelled like chemicals too. Tragic personal anecdote. Explained. Been cursed by a sorceress or witch. Unknown who exactly. Physical characteristics. Small woman, seemingly ageless. Wearing blackish green clothing. Heavily tarnished silver jewelry. Wrinkled gray skin. Cold eyes. Responsibility. Admittedly mine. Deserved punishment. Debatable. Talking loudly in bank line. Bluetooth headset. Voice projecting. Pissed her off. Suddenly used magic. Evil hex. Flashing lights. Severed reality. Nothing comparable. Defies description. She told me that I can only use each word once. Then it is gone forever. Naturally, didn't believe at first. Any witnesses? Lacking. Examined immediate surroundings. Though malevolent conjurer had evaporated. Proof, regrettably, insufficient. My halting style within story, hopefully understandable. Conjunctions and articles, tantalizingly inaccessible. Despite doubting magical spell, took precautions, withheld speech until now, but it's proven valid. Methodology regardless, spoken, typed, written, sign language too, no matter. One single time per. Phoneme combination with meaning. Initially experimented using advanced vocabulary. Example, perfidious. Second attempt, unsuccessful. Do you finally comprehend? Further experimentation created more woe. Computer, unhelpful. Copy-paste loophole theorized. Inoperable. Jury-rigged keyboard. Self-trickery. Valiant effort. Yet, unmitigated failure. Clicking boxes. Additional technological workarounds. Universally hopeless. Literal scissors glue application similarly prevented. Other ideas contemplated. Slow, phonetic pronunciation. Infeasible. Foreign dialects. Spanish, French, Latin, German. Individually attempted. Tragically, loss carried over. Deliberate sound alteration gambit, especially accents. Equally pointless. Pigment medium improvisation presents unaffected results. Paint, pencil, chalk, crayon, marker, liquid paper, nail polish, lipstick, erasing, negative space, hand symbols, tracing sand lines holding stick, moving rocks, pebbles, pennies, drawing ketchup sentences atop burger buns, contorting body resembling letter shapes, arranging refrigerator magnets, alphabet soup manipulation, snow peeing, shaving cream covered mirror, condensation scribbles, pointing towards existing writing, indistinguishably futile, utterly heartbreakingly unworkable. Brain racked. Inventive devices. Solutions. Essentially exhausted. Must communicate this condition so others may understand. Friends. Strangers. Everyone. Consume offered knowledge. Perhaps if the note was shown to people, they would not think myself mute, stupid, rude, etc. Imagine unique situation yourself. Empathize. Interacting silently without text seems nightmarish. Endless frustration. Knowing nouns, verbs, adjectives, everything. However, enduring inability. 2. Express thoughts aloud. Textually. Career, family, love, legal issues, earning money, societal participation, permanently blocked. Emotional, intellectual connection sans verbal transmission. Theoretically beyond imagination. Possibly resigned fate. Imagining. Carrying around dictionary. Thesaurus. Red pen. Marking those respectively utilized. Crazy person clinging on to lost abilities. Like missing limb. Animalistic hermit life assured. Best cases. Mountain cabin. Hunting beasts. Gathering plants wordlessly. Conversely, possible urban pariah. Solo against city. Homeless? Presumably. Recluse. Unavoidably. Could abandon aesthetic tendencies. Become monk. Friar. Vows. Silence. Poverty. Strangely comforting perspective. Solitude. Doomed. Mentally free. Externally shackled. Never wish curse upon worst enemy. Reversing supernatural detriments. Likely impossible. Living under such limited conditions. Extremely frustrating. Painful. Researching female wizards' jinx symptoms proving difficult. Searching requires typing. Asking likewise. Determined, nonetheless. Help needed. Someone who will assist. Belief, sadly rare. Believers even sadder. Often insane themselves. Ceasing missive. Supply. Dwindling. Death. For many, it is a concept to be feared, to be respected. It is the ender of relationships, of knowledge, of everything that you were and will have ever been. They see it as nothing but a monster. The blades, ready at a moment's notice to cut clean through the fragile strings you call your life. For others, it is but the next great step in the journey of existence. When it is time for them to shed their physical bond with the world, they do so gladly and without hesitation. They know not what waits beyond, but hope that there is yet more to discover, to experience, to explore. They are happy to go on. Some simply consider it an escape, a way to flee from the pain of living, the hurt that comes from simply being alive. When life becomes too much to bear, they welcome the embrace of death, regardless of what may follow after. For them, they do not care about meeting it prematurely, or if there is more. They only desire for their suffering to cease. The one thing that all agree upon is that death is a universal truth. Just as every being has a beginning, there must also come an end. Everyone prepares for it in different ways, but the result is always the same. No matter the person, no matter the status, no matter your wealth, riches, family, friends, everyone finds themselves in the ground one day. But what if that weren't true? Let us consider the fantastic. If we were to delve into the realm of imagination and say perhaps that you were undying, what would the ramifications be? Well, there are two aspects to consider: physical and mental. Let us assume for a moment that even if you weren't to die, your body would still be susceptible to aging, to disease, to lacerations. If you were to continue aging far beyond the limits of our programmed destruction, life would quickly become a living hell. Your body would degrade, becoming weaker and weaker with each passing day. Eventually, if it hadn't happened already, you'd no longer be able to walk, as your muscles and bones would have become far too fragile to support your weight. Soon, you wouldn't be able to move at all, lest you tear your body apart. And once your eyes were used up and dry, the world would turn black to them, as well as the rest of your senses in due time. Imagine a fate such as that, paralyzed, blind and deaf to reality, but alive. A mass of disintegrated bones and flesh, maybe no more than a puddle of soupy tissue, but yes, still alive. Not so extravagant a thought, is it? Or maybe, earlier on in your eternal life, you found yourself struck down with a disease of some kind. Maybe cancer. While many others have failed to beat it, you wouldn't fail. However, perhaps you wouldn't quite succeed either. It is possible to assume that without proper and timely treatment, you'd simply be stuck in a stalemate with it for the rest of your life, which in your case is a long while. Imagine the pain that others go through in those last few months of their life, where many people are ever eager for their death to arrive, for an end to their suffering, a torture so great it forces people to beg for the sweet release of life leaving their bodies. But that isn't an available option to you, is it? No, you'll simply be left to your torment, as the tumors continually grow, pressing hard against your bones, your nerves, your muscles, enveloping everything inside of you. Who knows what will happen given enough time? No one before you has lived long enough to see it. And finally, what if you were wounded? What if you were tortured? If they cut your limbs apart and left you there, because they have a guarantee that you won't die? What if they removed your skin, inch by inch, until you were nothing but bloody muscle and tendon underneath, where even the lightest of touches would send cascading waves of pain throughout your vessel, but not kill you? That is what you face on the physical aspect, if you were to become invulnerable to death. But now, we must move on to the mental consequences. Let us ignore all of what has been stated above, and imagine that you're a perfectly healthy individual. No sickness, and no aging. For 50 years or so, you might feel very confident about your choice. But what happens when your family starts to die? Your parents may be expected, but what of your siblings? What of your best friends? Having to watch each one's last breath, clasp each hand as their strength leaves them. How many funerals would you have to attend? when everyone you've ever known and loved has died? How would you maintain a family? If you were to bear children with your wife or husband, how would that impact your relationship? As they continue to age and grow older as you stay the same, a single moment of your life frozen in time forever. Eventually, your children would surpass you, and not only would you witness the death of your significant other, but it would also be your children whose hand you must hold as they travel into the next realm, and then your grandchildren, and their children, and so on and so forth. It's all right, you'll just start over. In a few decades, you'll be able to move on, to leave and start a different bloodline than the one you've now abandoned. And then, you'll have to undergo the same exact process again, losing your love, then your children, over and over with each new glimmer of hope you gain to lead a normal life. They say that there's no greater punishment than having to bury one of your own children. Well, you'll have to bury all of them. Maybe you grow wise and distance yourself from humanity before you go insane from the mental stresses that simply existing places on your mind. That's only a temporary solution, unfortunately. Everything is when you can't die. When the earth gets consumed by the sun in billions of years, and the sun burns itself out of existence, then what is left? You'd still be there, the one constant in the entirety of the universe, floating through dust and ghosts of your solar system, throughout the dark void of space. No oxygen, no heat, and no company. Completely alone for the rest of eternity. When the universe finally dies, will that be the end of you? Will it finally be your time, or will you be forced to still linger on, witnessing reality as it was never meant to be seen? Such is the gift of mortality. Everyone at some point in their life asks themselves, what would it be like to live forever? That is not the question they should be asking, however. The true question you should ask yourself is this: what happens when an immortal wants to die? For me, yesterday was Tuesday. The day before that was also Tuesday. The rest of today will be Tuesday. Tomorrow could be Tuesday too, but I won't know until I get there. It isn't that hard to explain. You, like most people, experience every day once. There's a certain poetry in that, although most people don't see it. It means every day is your only shot. You don't get to try again because what you do has permanence. Beautiful, unmistakable permanence. You have the certainty that what you do today will continue to be what you did today when you wake up tomorrow morning. That's a luxury I don't have. I've had my curse for several years, though it was only a month ago when it began. It was a Monday in September. I woke up. It was raining outside. I ate a bowl of Cheerios. I showered and brushed my teeth. Then I went to school. I'm in high school. I will be forever at this rate. My first class was Algebra 2, and God, was it boring. I couldn't pay attention to any of it. Then I had equally boring adventures in English, US history, and physics. After that came lunch. I ate with my friend Samantha. I've known her for at least 2 years. She's only known me for about 4 months. But I like to think that because I know her so well, that she gets just as much out of our friendship. We were eating lunch in our school's library. We always eat there. It's kind of like our tradition. Her parents have been fighting a lot lately. She confided in me. Divorce was imminent. Honestly, it'd be a sweet release. Those were her exact words. I nodded. Teenage boys never know what to say when it really matters. All I could do was look around at the other kids in the library. Slackers trying hard to finish that last assignment. Nerds playing Magic the Gathering. Quiet brains reading in the corner. We talked and ate until the bell rang. Then we both went to our separate classes. I had Spanish and my creative cooking class. Then the school day was over. There was track practice after school, but I decided to ditch and just go home instead. There was a dull pain developing in my stomach that made me think I was getting sick. When I got home, I flipped on the TV and watched for a few hours, intermittently checking the internet or doing my homework. My parents didn't get home until later that evening. When they finally did, around 9 or 10 o'clock, we ate reheated hamburgers and watched part of an episode of Dexter together. They were too tired to make it through the whole thing. Don't spend the entire night in front of the TV. Good night, they told me. After the episode ended, I went to bed. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up. The sound of rain tapping my window filled my ears. I ate a bowl of Cheerios, showered, and brushed my teeth. I then went to school. I went to Algebra 2, and it was even more boring than the day before. I already knew all of this stuff. Why learn it again? Then I went to English, US history, and physics. Each one boring, repetitive, and pointless. I met Samantha in the library for lunch. Nothing new to report, I told her. School is as dull as ever. Then she told me about her parents. Said they had been fighting lately. That they were thinking about getting a divorce. Wait, didn't you tell me all this yesterday? I asked.
No, I don't think so.
I nodded. Obviously she had, but it wasn't time to harp on her about her forgetfulness.
I kinda hope they get divorced. Honestly, it'd be a sweet release. They haven't gotten along for years.
A sweet release. That phrase sounded so familiar. I think you said that yesterday too.
When?
When we ate lunch.
What are you talking about?
My gaze drifted from her to the people around us. A group of less popular kids playing Magic the Gathering. A boy who always talked too much in class putting the finishing touches on a paper. A small mousy girl reading in the corner by herself. All of them in the same place they had been the day before.
Martin, are you okay? You're acting weird.
Samantha shook my shoulder. Everything seemed so familiar. I told her I was fine and that I was just having a strange day. Deja vu, I said. We finished lunch together. I went to my remaining 3 classes. I had track practice, but I felt sick to my stomach, so I went home instead. My parents weren't there when I got home. I waited for them like I had the day before. My dogs kept me company while I watched TV. The same channels showed the same shows. When my parents came home, we had leftovers again. Hamburgers. We watched part of an episode of Dexter. We've already seen this one. My mom shook her head. Said she didn't remember it. My dad agreed with her. Said Netflix says this was the next unplayed episode. They were too tired to finish watching. As they ascended the stairs to bed, my dad turned to tell me something. I knew what he was going to say. The words left my mouth first. Don't spend the entire night in front of the TV. Took the words right out of my mouth. Night, kiddo. The feeling of deja vu blared in my mind. That day had been exactly the same as the day before. As I lay down in bed, I noticed my phone for the first time. Monday, September 19th. Panic started setting in. Had I dreamt my whole day ahead of time? Were my memories of the day fake? I tossed and turned in bed, worrying. Eventually, exhaustion forced my frantic mind to sleep. The next day was the same, and the next. Same conversation about divorce with Samantha. Same boring classes. Same half episode of Dexter with my parents. I thought the same thing that anyone else would be thinking. Somehow, I had ended up in a low-budget version of the movie Groundhog Day. For 5 days this went on. It was funny. On the evening of the 5th consecutive Monday, shortly before I fell asleep, I promised myself that if tomorrow was the same, I was going to go to a hospital and have them figure out what was wrong with me. But, on day 6, everything was different. We were out of Cheerios. My classes taught different lessons and Samantha didn't show up to school. Her parents had apparently taken her out so they could talk to her about the divorce. My phone finally stopped reading Monday the 19th, and instead read Tuesday the 20th. I've never felt relief like that before. That was until the next day. The Cheerio box remained empty. Samantha was gone. And my phone broke the same horrible news to me as the day before. It was Tuesday, the 20th. The next 7 consecutive days were Tuesday the 20th. With every repeated day, I feared that I had fallen into some sort of time loop. But, on what would have been the 9th Tuesday, it became Wednesday. Wednesday repeated 4 times. Thursday repeated 3 times. Friday repeated 9 times, and so on and so on. Most days repeat somewhere between 3 and 6 times. Every day resets back to the moment I woke up. Sometimes I change the things I do. I turn left instead of going right when I know there will be a car accident up ahead. I avoid people who are going to be in bad moods. I skip watching TV because I already know what each character is going to say in each scene. Here's the thing though. Only the last day takes. So, if I repeated a Monday 4 times, and on the 3rd instance of that Monday I wrecked my car, but I didn't wreck on the 4th Monday, then I wouldn't have a wrecked car when it became Tuesday. I know what you're thinking. That's a silver lining, right? I can do anything I want to anyone and it doesn't matter because it'll all be erased at midnight. But there's a problem. I can never tell when a day is going to be the last occurrence of that day. The most I've ever had a day repeat itself is 17 times. That was the day my grandmother died. I was in the room with her. Just the 2 of us. Every time. We were in the hospital, where she was recovering from a bout of pneumonia. Her frame was bathed in sterile hospital lights. The hunched figure underneath those sheets looked more like a ghost than my grandmother. She was looking at me. Her mouth opened, and she started to say something, but then all of a sudden, she let out this god-awful scream. It froze my blood. And then she was gone. Heart failure. No one could have seen it coming. I tried warning the doctors a few times, but they were never able to stop it. After a while, I just started letting it happen, savoring every moment I had with her before they were gone. When one of your loved one dies, you get to walk away from it knowing that it's over. But I had to relive her death over and over again. 17 times I watched the life get ripped out of her body. It never did get any easier. There is a little bit of a pattern to when the days repeat themselves. I found that particularly difficult days, the traumatic, stressful days where you're just begging the universe to move on and let that day end, they're the ones that repeat themselves the most. Every horror that I face, whether emotional or physical, I face over and over again. Sometimes it's like being in hell. Thus far, I haven't had a reason to tell anyone about this. They'll just think I'm crazy. I don't appear to be aging any quicker, and although it can get boring sometimes, I've grown pretty accustomed to the repetition. Plus, I'd be remiss not to mention the benefits. My grades have gotten much better because I've always seen the test answers beforehand. I can make a little money betting on football, and I usually get a redo when I say something stupid to a girl. It's much harder to change big things because I only get to repeat one day at a time. So I haven't saved anybody's life or anything like that. Until today, I've never seriously considered telling anyone about this. But I think I have to now. Today is the 9th consecutive Tuesday, the 18th, I've been through. It might be the last Tuesday, or maybe it won't be. I need to tell someone about what happens because no matter how hard I try, I can't find any way to prevent it. Here's how my day will go. I wake up in the window seat of an airplane. Outside, all I can see is the ocean and a darkened sky. My phone reads 4 a.m., wherever I am. My family is on a red-eye to Japan, our dream vacation. My mother is sitting next to me and I decide to let her sleep for a while. I turn on the little computer screen on the seat in front of me. We still have 7 hours to go on our flight. I read for a while from a book I bought on the flight. Watership Down, if you were wondering. Then I doze off and on for a while. Around 6 a.m., everyone that I can see on the flight is still asleep. Except for this big guy sitting a couple rows in front of me. He's a heavy-set man in a white business shirt and gray slacks. Looks like a real mess of a guy. Balding. Dirty. You know the type. At 6:13, he unbuckles his seatbelt and stands up. He fills the entire aisle and some of the seats next to him. His head just barely reaches the ceiling. The heavy-set man puts a hand in the pocket of his slacks, and he pulls out something black. Then there is yelling. First from the man, then from the people on the plane who are waking up.
Everybody stay where you are!
Who are you? What are you doing?
Shut up! Everyone's going to stay in their seats and be quiet.
I can see other men standing up farther down in the plane. They all have guns. These men are all dressed the same. They're all middle-aged and dirty-looking. They're hijackers. Many passengers are crying. There's a delirious woman in the row behind me who's hyperventilating and won't stop screaming. The heavy-set man walks over to her.
Shut up!
Please, don't hurt us.
I said shut up!
There is a ringing in my ears and my vision blurs. Little droplets of red have covered the walls and the surrounding seats. Screams erupt from all sides of me. A baby starts crying somewhere near the back of the plane.
That's what happens if you talk. So everyone keep your goddamn mouths shut.
My mother grabs a hold of me tightly, and the men keep their guns trained on us. There must be at least 10 of them. Nobody moves an inch. Near the front of the plane, I hear 2 more gunshots. Then I feel my stomach lurch forward. The window shows an ocean that had once been perfectly flat. It's now diagonal and growing larger every second. The crash lasts only for a second. Down the aisle, I see the plane disintegrate as it strikes the water. My last memory is my mother's face being torn from her skull, just as the words "I love you" disappear from her lips. Everything goes dark, and my ears start ringing. Then I wake up. It's 4 a.m. I'm on a red-eye flight to Japan with my family. I have 2 hours to live. The second time this happened, I tried to warn the pilots. They wouldn't listen to me. The third time, I tried to warn the other passengers. One of the hijackers stood up and fired his gun at me before I could even finish telling them. Immediately after that, I woke up. I was still in my window seat, and the 4th iteration of this day was beginning all around me again. There was no chance of me trying to stop the hijackers. There was simply too many of them. I've told the flight attendants. I've told my mom. I've done everything I could. Strangely enough, People don't believe you when you say a bunch of middle-aged men will crash your plane in 2 hours. There's in-plane Wi-Fi. Around the 5th time I woke up, I snuck my mom's credit card out of her purse to pay for it. I've tried contacting the government, the TSA, air control, everything you can think of. The hijackers always win. There's far too many of them, and there's too little time to warn everyone else. I'm not sure how many times this day will repeat itself. Maybe tomorrow I'll wake up and it will be Tuesday again. Or maybe I won't wake up at all. This is the 2nd time I've set this message to upload. The first time didn't take. I want to say a few things in case this reaches anyone I know. To my family, I love you. You were always there for me no matter what. To my friends, thank you for putting up with me for all these years. You've made life worth it. Especially Samantha. Samantha, if you get a chance to read this, I've always had a crush on you. Even with thousands of repeated days, I never knew how to tell you until now. I'm sorry I waited so long. It's almost time for the hijackers to start, so I guess I better go. In case you haven't figured it out, if you're listening to this, that means this time, it took. And it means I'm already gone.